Tonight our speaker is Carleton Young, who is a Pittsburgh native. He has undergraduate degrees in economics from Westminster College and in English from Point Park University, an MA in history from Ohio University, and his PhD in history from the University of Pittsburgh. For 37 years, he taught advanced placement American history at Thomas Jefferson High School in Pittsburgh. He has also taught classes as an adjunct professor at the Community College of Allegheny County, the University of Pittsburgh, Eastern Gateway Community College, and in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. We are lucky to be able to have Carleton with us this evening because he's been a busy guy. Earlier this week, he was in Petersburg, Virginia, and then he was in Harper's Ferry, and then on Monday, I think he's going to Wheeling, West Virginia, which is sort of on his way home. So we're very, he's presenting at a variety of Civil War roundtable groups in those various areas. His book, Voices in the Attic, results from diligent research that he, his wife, and another couple did in transcribing and investigating the letters home from two brothers from Orange County, Vermont. I've read the book and highly recommend it. I was hoping to have Carleton autograph my copy until I realized it's on my iPad. Oops. With that, I yield the mic to Carleton Young.
Okay, I guess I should mention first, the reason I put the chair right here is I've developed a little bit of an inner ear problem that causes me to feel kind of lightheaded sometimes. I'm standing too long, so I might be standing or might be sitting. We'll just see how it goes. But anyway, thanks for inviting me to come tell my story tonight. And it is a story that starts with something which probably many of you had to experience at some point in your life. Is that almost 15 years ago, we had to empty out my parents' house. They passed away. If any of you have ever had to empty out someone else's house, you know that there is a lot involved in that. You know, it's not just the furniture and appliances, but there's all that stuff. And all the things in closets and drawers and storage areas. You're trying to decide what are you going to keep and what are you going to do with it all. Well, this was the house I'd grown up in Pittsburgh. I was not expecting to find much of anything I wasn't familiar with, but up in the attic, we found this very old wooden box that I'd never seen before. We brought it down, opened it up, and it was just jammed full of very old letters, which it turned out were Civil War letters written by two brothers from Vermont. Their last name was Martin, Henry and Francis Martin, and what they later learned was that they were members of what's known as the Vermont Brigade, which was the 2nd through the 6th Infantry Regiments from Vermont. And this was a brigade that was renowned for their heroism and fighting ability. They also had the highest number of casualties of any brigade in the Union Army. But just the fact that these letters were from Vermont Brigade let us know right away that they were going to be important. So the next question was what to do with them all. And there were a lot of them. When I say we had a lot of letters, I've seen entire books based on someone having like 20 letters from a Civil War soldier, or 40 letters, or 60 letters. Well, we had about 250. So it was an enormous collection. This is the box. The letters were all in their envelopes addressed back to the boys' parents mostly, back in this little town of Williamstown, Vermont. Now, you heard my bio. I had a bit of a history background, but I never had any real special interest in the Civil War up until that point. So the next step for me was to call in a couple of friends who were much more Civil War Buffs, Ed Hill, Bill Lutz here, and they looked over the letters, at least a few of them, and said, yeah, these are obviously very good letters. We're going to have to do something with this. So the next step was call in our wives. So my wife Carol is here tonight, Ed's wife Nancy. The five of us began to have weekly meetings to go through these letters together. First thing we did was get them into acid-free folders, protect them, then get them organized into like who wrote each one, to whom, from where, get them chronological. And then the next step was to actually start to read them. And this ended up being a kind of a difficult process. This is an example of one of the letters. Henry enters the service first. He's writing this to his brother Francis, dear brother. This one from camp in front of Richmond, Virginia in June of 1862. So this is very early in the war during the Peninsula Campaign, when they almost made it through to Richmond. So if you think of a piece of paper folded in half, we've got page 1 over here, 4 here, 2 and 3 on the other side. He gets to the end of the letter, signs his name right here, but then he thinks of something else he wants to say. Well, they had shortages of paper. He does not want to waste another sheet. So he turns the letter sideways and writes directly across what he's already written, and then signs his name a second time right there. This was known as cross-writing, and Civil War soldiers did this sometimes to save paper. Unfortunately, our brothers did this a lot. And so here is a month later. Now it's July of 1862. They've been pushed down to Harrison's Landing. Henry writes to his brother again. Same thing, gets to page 4, turns it sideways, writes across it. Another thing we found, like in this next letter, is that oftentimes as you get towards the end, he'd start writing real small, it'd be kind of hard to read. But then he still didn't fit, so he went back to page 1, did cross right here. Or another thing we found was oftentimes, like this next letter, he'd start writing the letter rather slowly and carefully. It'd be relatively easy to read, but then it would become increasingly sloppy and then throwing in things out here. Or just one more example, because this one I think has a little bit of everything. Not only does it become smaller and sloppy, but then it goes back to page 1 and writes across it. So in our weekly meetings, the five of us would each have a copy of the letter. We'd be going through it together, trying to get it transcribed. And we'd be turning the letter this way and that way and trying to figure out what we were looking at. And we would get stuck on a word. That's what we would sit there maybe for about 2 or 3 minutes in silence or mumbling to ourselves. What is that word? And then usually somebody would get it. And they'd shout out the word. We'd all say, yeah, that's it. And then we'd go on to the next word. And on it would go. So it took us a long time to get through all these letters once. And then, once we had about two or 3 years to get through once. And then we went back to the very beginning, started all over again because we'd skipped a lot of words and passages we couldn't figure out. But now we knew the handwriting better, and we knew the boy's story. We were able to go back and fill in all the gaps and get the letters all transcribed. So that was one thing we were doing. The other thing we did was to travel a lot. We would go to the battlefields and places where the boys had been. In fact, Fredericksburg was one of the first places we went to because so many of the letters were sent from down around this area. In fact, in Fredericksburg, when we first got there, we saw someone that looked like they were working there, went up to them and said, we were wondering if you know a good bit about the battle here. We had some questions with our letters. The person we happened to pick was Frank O'Reilly. And yeah, he knew a bit about the battle. He was able to, and so he was a big help getting us started in this whole project. But at any place we went, the park rangers and the historians always were really impressed with the depth of these letters and the kind of things that they were dealing with. The other thing we did was to travel to Vermont, to the boys' hometown. Now, so the boys are from this little town called Williamstown, which is a very small town in central Vermont. Williamstown is about 6 miles south of Barry, Vermont, which is where my father grew up. So we always knew these letters had to be connected to my father's side of the family in some way. Barry, in turn, is about 6 miles south of the state capital, Montpelier. This is Williamstown. This congregational church is the church that our boys grew up in. It was built in the 1820s. And just to jump ahead of the story a little bit. We've been up to Williamstown many times, but one of the things that really surprised us in the letters was how good the mail service was during the Civil War. These boys down here in Virginia in their camps would be getting letters that had only been written 2 or 3 days earlier from up in central Vermont. And since the mail service was that good, people sent care packages. They sent food, perishable goods through the mail. And one of the things that this church sent on many occasions was chicken pies. These big chicken pot pies that the boys would be getting, and maybe thanking their parents for sending these things, and thanking the church members for the chicken pies that they'd be sharing in their camp. And so we were, a couple of years ago, my wife and I were driving through Williamstown, and in front of the boys' church was a big banner that said, "Chicken pie dinner tonight." It turns out that's a big fundraiser up in Vermont. The churches had these chicken pie dinners, so we were able to go to the boys' church and eat that recipe for a chicken pie. Sadly, though, a couple months ago, fire swept through the church, totally destroyed the church. The only thing they were able to salvage was up in the bell tower, Paul Revere Company bell that survived the fire, and that was the only thing that was left. But anyway, next to the church is a Civil War monument. So the first time we went up there, we parked by the church and went over and said, "Oh, great. We came up to find out about our soldiers in the Civil War, the Civil War monument." We went up and started reading all the names all around the boys in the town, and our 2 brothers are not listed. We thought, this is crazy. We drove all the way to Vermont, but we know them from here. We have the letters, they're addressed here, we have their military records. And so this was one of many mysteries that made this so interesting for me, because there was a question of, I knew my family history a bit. I'd never heard of anyone with the last name of Martin in our family. Had no idea if we were related to these boys, how these letters ended up in my parents' attic in Pittsburgh, or why my father never said to me, "Oh, by the way, you like history. You should see what I have. I've got like Civil War letters." Yeah, none of this made a whole lot of sense. But this one we did get somewhat figured out. It turns out when they built this monument in 1869, by going through old town records, we found that they had decided to only put on the names of the boys who were drafted to fill the town quota. Our boys enlisted, so they were not eligible. Now, why they did that, we're not quite sure the reason behind it. We're thinking there must have been some kind of local political dispute or argument going on why they would choose to do that, but that's what they did. Anyway, next to the monument, next building down here, is the local historical society. So the first time we went up to Williamstown, we decided to go inside. We told the person in the building a little about our letters. We said the letters are addressed to the boy's father. His name is Chester Martin. So we said, we know this was a century and a half ago, but did you ever hear of a local farmer named Chester Martin living somewhere around here? The person in the historical society said, "Well, sure, Chester Martin's house, right down the road." So he gave us directions, and down we went and found the boy's house. So this is the house that our Civil War soldiers grew up in. That today, not only is it still there, it is now the front of a like an assisted living home. So they've taken out the back wall and built the assisted living area to the back and to the side. But the original house is now like the lobby and the office area. So we walked inside our boy's house and found that it was all decorated like Civil War era. So here we are. Yeah, we know we were going to find this. We find our boy's house, we walk in, it's like it was at the time of the Civil War. Then we found out where they were buried, went up to the cemetery, and we were walking along, looking at all the names on the markers, and we saw this railed-in section towards the back, and went back, and sure enough, that was our Martin family, Chester Martin and his wife, and all the children buried there in the family plot. So it's been lots of interesting finds as we've gone through this. But now as for our soldiers, first one I want to take a look at is Henry. His full name was William Henry Martin. They went by Henry. And from what we've been able to learn, Henry must have been a relatively friendly, well-liked person, that when his regiment was formed, 4th Vermont Infantry, it's young guys from the same area, same county, many of them have been in school together, know each other, and they were allowed to select some of their officers. And they did choose Henry initially as a sergeant, so they must have liked him and respected him to some degree. He's also someone that has a pretty good education. So this is a point in time, in the Civil War, there were not yet any public high schools in the United States. That for children who were going to a public school, education usually ended at about the 8th grade level. But for families that had a bit more money, and you saw from the house, this family was fairly well off, they would often send their children to private academies, secondary schools. And Henry had attended Barry Academy in nearby Barry, Vermont. His brother Francis, who we'll be looking at in a little bit, had attended Kimball Union Academy, which was a private residential school in New Hampshire. And in fact, it's still in existence today. And even their sister, and this was especially a little unusual for a rural area like this, a girl from one of the farming areas, but Caroline had attended Mrs. Peabody's Select Family School for Young Women, which was located on the campus of Dartmouth College in Webster Hall. So this is a family that very clearly values education, to send their daughter off to a private residential school like that. But, and I think it's one of the reasons the boys' letters are so good, is that they really knew how to write and tell their story, and they told what they were experiencing all through this war. So as for, and we also had with the letters, lots of like handwritten orders from different officers. We had officer commission papers, like these for Henry. And then eventually, by connecting through my family tree back to these soldiers, I found that I had a cousin who I never even knew I had, and contacted her, and she ended up having Henry's sword. So we went to visit her, and there it is, W.H. Boone Henry Martin, Company A, 4th Vermont Infantry. So we have been amazed by all the things we've found and been going through this. So as for Henry and his story, he will be entering the war as regiments formed just after the first battle of Bull Run. He'll then be heading down to Washington, D.C. area for his training. He'll be traveling, he's never been far from home before, but now he's traveling by a combination of steamboat and railroad cars to get down here. And of course, he has to go through Maryland, which is a little bit of a unusual situation because Maryland stayed within the Union, but it was a slave state. And there was mixed opinion, people on both sides. And so one of his, and there have been cases of recruits being attacked by pro-Confederate mobs as they went through Maryland. So in one of his first letters, Henry writes home, he says, "We passed through the streets where the Massachusetts men had been mobbed, but we did not have any trouble. Some people would wish us to bring back Jefferson Davis's scalp. Others would cry out, hooray for Davis. After dinner, we took the cars for Washington. We left, marched to a place called the Soldiers' Rest. There we stacked arms, ate supper, spread our blankets, slept the rest of the night. In the morning, we received orders to march to our encampment about 3/4 of a mile from the city of Washington. There we joined a large army of 40,000 men. I never saw such a sight before. There were thousands of cavalry, flying artillery, infantry on drill when we arrived. The cavalry charging at full speed, accompanied with flying artillery, was a grand sight." So this is all kind of exciting for Henry at first. The camp he's talking about, where they I found this photograph of Vermont Brigade soldiers at their camp. Their camp was located on the grounds of what is today the CIA headquarters. And so I had thought it might be fun to show up with the CIA someday and tell them about my letters and say, it's okay, I'll just walk around and check things out here and see what they have to say. But anyway, he's going to be there for quite a while. And one of the things he'll get to do, which I really would not even have thought of, is he does get to do a good bit of sightseeing. They're not training all day, every day. And he'll talk in his letters about crossing the Chain Bridge. And there's a photograph of Chain Bridge during the Civil War. And then work his way on into the city. And he talks about walking past the White House. He He tours through the Capitol building. He goes to the Smithsonian Museum. So he's seen all the sites while he's there. So it's kind of exciting at first, but before too long, it's going to start to be a problem. And the problem is going to be disease. You've got this situation, all these young guys, many have never been far from home before. Now they're all mixed together in these camps. So you've got problems with immunities to disease. You have the problem that you just don't know a lot about good health care and hygiene. So people start getting sick. And after he's been there for a couple months, Henry writes home, there's a great amount of sickness in the regiment. Charles Lynn's very bad, John Green's unwell, Faye's on the sick list, Dick Jones, Cosgrove, Frank Flint. As parents know all these people, because like I said, they're all, so many people in this regiment are from the same area. Measles and mumps prevail extensively. Newell Carleton is quite sick with typhoid fever, but we hope he will soon be better. Well, his friend, Newell, who'd just been in school with a few years earlier, does not improve. In a later letter, he writes, as soon as he was confined to his bunk, I had him moved to my tent, where it was more still and more spare room. He remained there about 2 weeks, received as good a care and attention as had been given under the circumstances. He was not in his right mind at nights, constantly spoke of his father, and was finally removed to the hospital, where he received pretty good care, but he grew worse every time his fever changed, and last Saturday night, about 8 p.m., he died. So this became the first of many friends and relatives of Henry who will die in this war. And as time goes on, things just keep getting worse and worse. Another letter, he writes, when we left Vermont, my regiment numbered 1,100 strong, able-bodied men. Over 60 have now died of disease, and a great number are sick. My company numbered 101, but today only 36 privates are available for duty. So they are having just a terrible time. In another letter, he writes home to his parents, he says, I see sights that would make any one of you at home shudder. Almost every morning, we see outside the hospital a corpse of one of our fellow soldiers, there to remain until the next day. Finally, the corpse is dressed, placed in a pine coffin, and ready for burial. I found this photograph of Vermont Brigade soldiers burying their dead at that camp. In his letter, Henry goes through the whole procedure of what they do at these burial ceremonies. It was kind of interesting the way he concludes the letter. He says, all of these scenes we become familiar with and think but little of. So it's like it's just an everyday thing. They're out training, they go take a break, go to the burial ceremony, come back, continue the training, and all that goes for week after week and month after month in this camp. Now, before we get to Henry actually going to combat, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other people in the letters, because we found all these tangents we would go off, because Henry would talk about people in the camp with them or people back home, and we started researching them and find lots of interesting stories. One of the more interesting is Uncle Isaac. This is Henry's cousin, Major Isaac Lynn, and the situation here is very early in the war. There's going to be, Isaac Lynn is going to have a command out west, in fact, way out west, all the way out in New Mexico. And in a very early phase of the war, a group of Texans, Confederates, are going to come across the border. Isaac Lynn will take his men out to face them. Now, unless you are a real Civil War buff, you may have never heard of the Battle of Mesilla. It's not one of your big ones. It's only a few hundred people on both sides, relatively light casualties. Although, when I gave a talk at Hampton Roads, there was a woman there who actually had been at the battlefield. But at any rate, at this battle, Isaac Lynn did not feel it was going real well. He's going to pull his men back into his fort. But he also realized the fort was not really defensible because the Texans had artillery with them. So Isaac Lynn, the next day, is going to order his men on a fast march to another fort. Unfortunately, many of his men just could not bear the thought of leaving behind their stores of whiskey. Many of them filled their canteens with whiskey. The next day, They're out in the hot desert sun. People are getting sick and dehydrated. Texans catch up with them and surround them. Isaac Lynn is going to have to surrender his entire command. Like I said, the numbers are very small in terms of the great scope of the Civil War. It doesn't really matter that much. But Isaac Lynn had the misfortune of this happening just 3 days after the first Battle of Bull Run. So there had been a surprise defeat of the Union Army in the first big battle of the war. Now comes word they just lost something out west. So it doesn't go over real well. Isaac Lynn is relieved of his command. So he comes back to Washington, D.C. to try to get a private meeting with Abraham Lincoln to give his side of the story about what happened out west. And he's going to be staying in the Vermont Brigade camp because he knows so many people there. Plus his son is there. His son, that's Henry's cousin, is in the same regiment as Henry. And so Henry has a bunch of letters home talking about Uncle Isaac being there and the things he's saying. But Isaac Lynn also has a daughter. His daughter, Louise, was married to Brigadier General Frederick Dent. Now, back in his school days, Frederick Dent had been roommates and very close friends with Ulysses S. Grant. And, in fact, he introduced Grant to his sister, Julia, who Grant married. So Henry's cousin, he's grown up in this little town, is not only married to a Brigadier General, but she's sister-in-law to Ulysses S. Grant. And Isaac Lynn has another daughter. His other daughter, Mary, is married to Major Norman Fitzhugh, who's Assistant Adjutant General for General Jeb Stuart on the Confederate side. So it just amazed us. This was such a small town, but the number of people who had an impact on the Civil War and the years that followed are going to just be way out of proportion to the size of this town. Well, here, back to the war. Henry is in the Army of the Potomac, and initially then under General McClellan. And I'm sure most of you are familiar, McClellan's going to be gaining a reputation of being perhaps overly cautious and slow-moving. And that kind of attitude is shown in Henry's letters. And one of his letters, he writes home, he says, "We still remain at camp. You can see how many expectations we have and how few are realized. Soldiers remark quite often, they'll never have a chance of seeing a rebel if they stay in this army." So that was the feeling, like, enough training, let's get this going. And as it turns out, even though it seemed like McClellan was just kind of sitting around not doing a whole lot, he actually is coming up with a plan. And the plan he comes up with will be what's known as the Peninsula Campaign. And so Henry will be part of this force, over 100,000 men transported by sea down to Fort Monroe, and then moving up the peninsula, trying to attack Richmond from the east, trying to avoid a lot of Confederate defenses north of Richmond. They blow up with that then, so they arrive at Fort Monroe, and then start moving rather slowly, cautiously up the peninsula, facing a lot of scattered resistance. A lot of small battles are fought. One of them is fought right here along the Warwick River. And once again, not a whole lot of people have heard of this battle. It is the Battle of Dam Number 1. But for Henry, Dam Number 1 is going to be a real important engagement because this is the first time he's ever actually gone into combat. He's not real sure just what this is going to be like. He talks in his letters about how they start off. He writes home, he says, "This was a memorable day in my experience, the first time I ever faced cold lead from an enemy's guns." And he describes how they got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, had their breakfast, got words of encouragement from their officers, and then went into battle. And when we visited Dam Number 1, I took this photograph which showed the Confederate earthworks that are still there. So Henry's going to be part of this force charging towards the Confederates who are back behind these defensive positions. He says, "Our colonel led the charge, flourishing his sword, encouraging his men on. Not a man flinched from his duty. It was a desperate charge, I'll assure you, in the face of thousands of rebels. My regiment lost only 10 killed. Other regiments suffered fearfully, and the enemy must have lost hundreds as our shot and shells kept bursting over the rifle pits." So he describes the whole battle and how it goes, but it's kind of interesting the way he closes this. He says, "I never expected to feel as I did on the occasion. After the first few shots, I felt perfectly self-possessed, ready to go anywhere we're ordered. This is a hasty outline of what occurred, without his clothes. and if spared to survive another battle, I shall write as soon as possible. So can't help but imagine his mother's reaction to that closing. If he's not killed in the next battle, we'll write home, so it's over now. To see how it goes. And off they go then, moving up the peninsula. My wife and I did this trip once where we started at Fort Monroe and then drove up and down the peninsula going to all the places Henry mentions. And so at dam number 1, I posted a picture and said, dragging my wife to another damn Civil War site. But they will, they'll be, Vermont soldiers will be very involved in the Battle of Williamsburg. They will be pushing the Confederates back further. So the 6th Corps that Henry's a part of is under General Franklin. They will make it to within within 12 miles of Richmond. And at that point, General McClellan is going to be calling a halt to all this. McClellan feeling that the Confederate defenses they had were too strong. And so things just coming to a sudden stop at that point. And of course, some historians think that with the numerical advantage the North had, they might have broken through and taken Richmond this early in the war. But anyways, Henry's seen a lot of interesting things along the way. One thing he got to see was the famous battle had taken place between the two ironclads, Merrimac and the Monitor, and he's able to get a real close-up look at the Monitor and writes home to his parents about it. But he really was not very impressed. He didn't think these ironclads were going to contribute much to the war. What he was much more impressed with in this campaign was the use of the balloons. These hydrogen-filled balloons, where they could see the Confederate troop movements and defensive positions. He thought this was going to be a major part of this war. But anyway, as things turn out, it's about to change very dramatically on the peninsula. General Joseph Johnston, severely injured, and Robert E. Lee will take over to defend Richmond. And Lee will decide that the best way to defend Richmond is to go on the offensive. That they will move out in what's known as the 7 days, this week of fighting, where there'll be lots of battles taking place, different parts of the army during the 7 days. Henry and the Vermont soldiers will be involved in several of those. One where he's involved in is Savage's Station. At Savage's Station, after the initial fighting there was word that another large Confederate force was approaching. And so the Union soldiers had to move out fast, and they had to leave their wounded soldiers behind, which Henry was not at all happy about. And I did find this photo, which is the wounded soldiers at Savage's Station. They're being left behind as the army is going to be pulling out. Another place they'll be fighting is going to be at White Oak Swamp. And at White Oak Swamp, the idea there is that the Union soldiers who have been left there are trying to slow down Stonewall Jackson, who's coming from the Shenandoah Valley. And as it turns out, this rear guard action is going to be very effective at White Oak Swamp. And as a result, Jackson is not going to get to where Lee had hoped to use him later in the 7 days. But at any rate, the end result of all this is that the Union Army has been pushed down to Malvern Hill. President Lincoln feels like McClellan has failed, so McClellan's authority will be reduced. He'll be ordered to bring the Army of the Potomac up north of Richmond, join up under General Pope's leadership, attack Richmond from the north. So Henry, part of this massive force, which is moving very slowly up towards Pope. As it turns out, Lee figures out what's happening and moves faster, and will find Pope at a familiar site back at Bull Run for the second Battle of Bull Run. The fighting there, Pope thought he had Stonewall Jackson cornered. He didn't realize he was being outflanked by Longstreet. So the end result is going to be another Union defeat, now its second Bull Run. Lincoln, for his part, I'm sure, is going back and forth wondering who should be in charge of this army in the East. And will eventually be turning back to McClellan to take full command. And it's right at this point in the war that McClellan gets one of the biggest breaks in the war when Lee has decided to launch an invasion up through Maryland and up into the north. But he has his army divided into sort of dangerously small groups. One of Lee's commanders leaves the orders accidentally behind at a campsite. Union soldiers come in, find the lost orders, turn them over to McClellan. If McClellan moved real fast, some historians think he might have been able to wipe out each part of Lee's army. He does not move real fast, but he did have some good reason. His, was for one thing, this new information did not fit a lot of the earlier information he had been receiving. Plus, he's thinking, could this be a trick? Did Lee have that left there on purpose to try and pull him in? So, but he does start moving that direction. And Lee will realize McClellan's army is coming, so Lee will be trying to get his army reformed along Antietam Creek at Sharpsburg. In order to get there, the Army of the Potomac has to come through this mountain range called South Mountain, where there are gaps they will have to go through. And the Franklin Sixth Corps will be going through Crampton's Gap. Now Henry talks about in the battle that he was towards the end of the front line charging uphill, and as this shows here, 4th Vermont is at the end of the front line, and so in this drawing, he would be somewhere down in here charging uphill towards the Confederates, which does not look like a good place to be in this battle. And also, my wife and I have climbed this hill. It's actually much steeper and more rugged than it looks in this picture. But as it turns out, the Union Army does greatly outnumber the Confederates at Crampton's Gap, so Confederates will start to retreat, but they've done what they were sent there to do, which is to greatly slow down the advance so that Lee can get his army together to try to stop this advance. So after this fighting at South Mountain, Henry writes home, he sounds like he's kind of had it with this fighting. He says, "How long is this incessant fighting to continue? Ever since we left Washington, the cannon's been booming. Seems like a severe fight every day. I was never before exposed to such a galling fire. Many a bullet whistled seemingly very close to my head. I did not do any like dodging. It felt perfectly cool and self-possessed. Still, it's a hard place to stand in. But trusting in the Lord to protect me, I go forward wherever I am ordered." So he's saying he's kind of at the end of his rope here, but he's a soldier. He'll go wherever he's ordered, and where he's being ordered to is Antietam, the single bloodiest day of the Civil War, is what he's heading for next. And so the Antietam, I'm sure many of you have visited there. You're familiar that the battle starts very early in the morning with fighting around 5:30 to 6 o'clock in the morning around the East Woods and down around the Dunker Church. Well, Franklin's Sixth Corps is not going to be getting there until about 11 o'clock in the morning. They have been sent down to help secure Harper's Ferry. So they're coming in after a lot of this fighting has already taken place. They will be heading down towards the famous area of the Sunken Road, Bloody Lane, and they will make their presence known with their advance. This marker shows where the Vermont Brigade advanced on this battlefield. But at that point, General McClellan is going to order the entire Sixth Corps to fall back. McClellan felt that based on his military intelligence reports, Lee's army should have been larger than what he saw in front of him. He thought Lee was hiding a lot of people back in reserve. So McClellan decides to bring the entire Sixth Corps back, hold it in reserve, to bring out later when it would be needed to face the rest of Lee's army. So for the rest of this battle, Henry's just an observer up on a hillside. When Carol and I visited the battlefield, our guide was able to take us to the hillside where the Vermont soldiers sat. So we were able to sit on that hillside where they were with the view they had in the battlefield as this was all taking place. But, and the end result is going to be just enormous casualties. So when it's all over, Henry writes home, "After the battle was the worst of sights. Every house was filled to the brim as thick as they could lie. Still there was no room. All the barns were filled the same way. Still there was no room. Hundreds had to lie out of doors. Many remained on the field 3 days. Many did not have their wounds dressed for 2 days. Their wounds in some instances became maggoty. The dead had to be piled in heaps and burned as it was impossible to bury them all." Now I showed that letter to one of the park rangers at Antietam. He said that they had heard stories that supposedly there were so many dead bodies to deal with that in some cases soldiers had just started to stack bodies up and burn them. But he said he never before had seen a first-hand account of someone saying they'd seen that until here it was in Henry's letter saying he saw them doing this. So, after all these casualties and things that, just not going well at all in Antietam, but soon there will be hope for change with new leadership, because Antietam is considered a Union victory since Lee retreated south, but President Lincoln is going to feel like McClellan should have pursued faster, should have tried to wipe out Lee's army instead of letting him get away. So we had a change in leadership. General Ambrose Burnside now taking command. So with Ambrose Burnside, of course, we get a new word in the English language with sideburns, that's facial hair, but we also get a new plan. And the new plan is going to be to try to move the Army of the Potomac very quickly down towards Fredericksburg, have pontoons brought down, create pontoon bridges to go through to the city, to establish themselves up on the heights above the city, and be in a very strong position to face Confederate army that tries to attack. And Burnside does, surprisingly, by moving as quickly as he does, to get down towards the Fredericksburg area. Of course, they get down here, and the pontoons have not yet arrived. And so they sit and they wait. And they wait, and while they're waiting, the Confederate army will establish itself on the heights above Fredericksburg. So probably the prudent thing for Burnside to have done would have been to say, well, it was a good plan, but it just didn't work. We have to try something else. But there are political issues too. This is the middle of December 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect January 1st. Lincoln wants a victory now to make it very clear they're in a position of strength at the point of the Emancipation Proclamation. And faced with that kind of pressure, Burnside decides to go ahead and launch the attack. It's going to be difficult even just getting the pontoons in place, facing enemy fire, and then making it to the city, trying to go building by building through Fredericksburg, and then ultimately to, once getting through the city, to have to go up towards these strong Confederate defenses up the stone wall up above. And so, as it turns out though, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, but usually when we just talk, people don't understand this, that there's more to this battle than what took place here, that a couple miles downriver, more pontoon bridges were put into place. In fact, Henry was part of the detail that installed these. And this is Franklin's 6th Corps, which is to come up through Stonewall Jackson's defenses and try to come up behind the Stonewall in another direction. And so that's where Henry's at. But now the problem is, today, that this is a national park up here. This area where the 6th Corps was has become developed. Henry was positioned right along Deep Run Creek. And today, around that position where Henry was, is a Wawa convenience store. But when we visited, we had, the creek was still there, Deep Run Creek, and so we parked and walked past the gas pumps and the convenience store and up along the creek and found the high ground where Henry is going to be talking about in his letter, where he's going to be part of this battle. So this is a blow up on Deep Run Creek. It's right here. This is Henry's regiment is right there, and then this is artillery back behind them. And so Henry will write, and he's going to be watching a whole lot of this fighting take place up on high ground here, watching all these blue arrows here, Union forces trying to break through, getting stopped. He says, I was in command of my company, with the captain being detached. Soon 2 regiments came out and charged on us. And that is these 2 North Carolina regiments that are coming this way, that they had realized that if they could come along the creek and break through the Vermont soldiers, they could capture their artillery behind them. And so all of a sudden, after just being an observer for quite a while, Henry finds himself in the midst of the fighting. He says, these 2 regiments came and charged on us. The shot flew like hail around us. We had to lie and take it. I did not let my men retreat until they were within about 10 rods of us. I found it useless to try to stop them any longer. Ordered to retreat, halted on the brow of a hill, all the time giving them deadly fire. Just then I saw the 3rd regiment coming to my assistance. Now, as it turns out, while this is taking place, Henry had a friend who was back in reserve who was watching this. His friend took out a piece of paper and a pencil and sketched the fighting. So Henry had been up here, but these are the North Carolina troops that pushed them back. Right here it says 4th Vermont, and Henry said they reformed their lines. And then the last thing I read was he said the 3rd Vermont came to their assistance. Right here it says 3rd Vermont. He says also our batteries open. So remember the cannon in the back behind them, the cannon would be firing over their heads into the North Carolina troops. So this staggered them. They turned and ran with us after them and retook our old position. They lost, I should judge, 100 men. The ground was strewed with dead all the way back to their old position, after which they ceased firing. And so Vermont soldiers done their part at Fredericksburg, but of course overall, it's, especially because of what happens back through the town and up by the stone wall, an enormous Confederate victory. So when it's all over, Henry writes home, he says, "Thus ended the fight. What we've accomplished, I do not see. I hope something. Our whole loss is reported 18,000. Sunday there was a flag of truce and the wounded brought off. I crossed the line Sunday, saw some of their dead and wounded where our regiment fought. The rebels are very friendly when the flag of truce is up. They are also very eager to have the war closed. The lines immediately join each other and we exchange coffee for tobacco." So can you imagine, after fighting like that, they call a ceasefire, the two sides come out in the middle, shake hands and talk and trade things back and forth, and then go back to their sides. It says, Monday we were relieved, went back to the rear. That night the whole army was ordered across the river, remained there ever since. I've been in battles before, but not one as equal to this last one. How I ever escaped, I cannot imagine. Exposed to solid shot grape and canister, a rifle ball has been a volley. It seems as though I must have been shielded by some unseen power. I was the object of sharpshooters, being so I could not get cover. I could do nothing but stand there and let them fire at me. I had the privilege of seeing all that was going on, to see a rebel regiment advance on us, also to see a battle take place in the open field. I've seen enough, and hope never to see the like again. If I ever felt grateful, it was when darkness covered the field. So, very much a low point for the Union Army after the battle at Fredericksburg, but soon there will be hope, new leadership. General Joseph Hooker will be taking command, replacing Burnside. Hooker will come up with a new plan. The new plan will be, now he has an enormous army with 130,000 men, Lee with about 65,000, so it's about 2-to-1 advantage. So he's got his cavalry sweeping around, breaking off supply lines, have part of the army attack from Fredericksburg again, but this time Hooker will be taking the rest of the army, we're behind Lee to Chancellorsville, and together then to move his men all around from different directions to crush this much smaller army of General Lee. But even though it looks like perhaps a good plan on paper, it's not going to quite turn out that way. That Lee will kind of defy what a lot of people saw as conventional wisdom at the time, being that if you're greatly outnumbered, you keep your army intact, you don't divide a small army. But Lee will do just that. He will leave part of the army at Fredericksburg, take the rest back towards Hooker and Chancellorsville. Now as for Henry, Henry is here. This is the 6th Corps, is at Fredericksburg. And they will be charging up against those Confederate defenses again. This is a photograph of some of the 6th Corps soldiers before the charge. Now, of course, they don't know how strongly defended the lines are. You know, this might be another suicide charge like the first Battle of Fredericksburg. But as it turns out, it's not as strongly defended this time. The stone wall does fall, which Henry wrote in his letters. He thought this was going to be a big turning point in the war that they'd finally done this. But it won't end up mattering a great deal because of what happens in the rest of the battle, where Lee has already divided his army once. Now he'll divide it again, having Stonewall Jackson circling back behind the Union forces and attacking them from different directions. Hooker, taken so by surprise, will fall back into this kind of a horseshoe-shaped defensive position, enabling Lee to send part of his forces back towards the 6th Corps. 6th Corps is now under General Sedgwick. So they'll be coming from Fredericksburg. They will fight a battle at Salem Church, and at Salem Church, 6th Corps is defeated. Sedgwick will retreat back across the river. When Hooker hears that Sedgwick is retreated, Hooker gives up and retreats as well. So it seems like no one can get the best of Robert E. Lee. But as it turns out, Lee is not totally satisfied either, because Lee's concern is, with the numerical advantage of the North plus the industrial might, he cannot keep stopping these large armies forever. His feeling is that maybe now is the time, if they could move up into central Pennsylvania and try to get a big victory, they could perhaps get a peace settlement to end this war. And so the Confederate Army will be moving first up towards central Pennsylvania. The Army of the Potomac will be trailing behind. And of course, this is this massive army of 100,000 men, and the Vermont soldiers, in this case, are going to be at the very end of the line. They are protecting supply lines as they move up through Maryland. So Henry writes home, he says, "We are now on our way through Maryland in all possible haste. We are expecting one of the roughest campaigns we ever had. It's reported that 40 men have died on the road on account of the heat. And this is June, very hot weather. Many are sunstruck. We never saw such hard marching before. We are covering the rear of the Potomac Army, have got the trains all safe within our lines. If this thing is managed properly, we will annihilate Lee's army. But we are dreadfully worn down. Pray for us. Thousands are to be sacrificed within the next few weeks." So it turns out he couldn't be much more prophetic than that. Like about 3 weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg, he says, thousands are to be sacrificed. He says, this time we're going to do it. This time we're going to defeat Lee's army. And so they also have had a change in leadership then, with General Meade taking command as they're moving up through Maryland. So the Battle of Gettysburg, like I said, the Vermont soldiers are at the end of the line. So they're not there. They're 35 miles south when the, Gettysburg, of course, a 3-day battle. So during that first day, when the Union forces are pushed back through Gettysburg and start to set up their famous fishhook defensive position, the Vermont soldiers are still down in Maryland. And even the second day, they're going to be coming in late in the day. They're under General Sedgwick, 6th Corps. They will be coming in after 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the second day. So they've missed a lot of the famous parts of the battle in the Peach Orchard and the Devil's Den and Chamberlain's Charge on Little Round Top and all that. But even though they're not there, Henry did have a cousin who was there. It was kind of an interesting story. His cousin, George Smith, was in the 17th U.S. And on that second day in the wheat field, he's going to be positioned. We have some of George Smith's letters. He comes across as this very friendly, fun-loving guy in his letters, talking about like the parties that they had in the good times and the young girls they met along the way, things like that. But at Gettysburg, though, so he's in the wheat field, very, very heavy casualties. In the midst of that fighting, George Smith is hit with a bullet in the chest. Now, in the Civil War, if you are hit in the chest, your survival chances are not real good. In this particular case, the combination of distance and wind velocity and humidity and everything played a part causes him to be with enough force, he's knocked to the ground, looks down, and finds the bullet had bounced off of his chest, but had not penetrated. And he's able to get back up and continue on in the fight. And ends up having a real interesting life. After the Civil War, he stayed in the Army, went out west under General Sheridan to fight in the Indian Wars, and then during the Gilded Age, he came back east to Philadelphia and went into business, and by the end of the century, he was listed in the Philadelphia Blue Book as one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia society. But back to the battle. Third day, the 6th Corps arrived, and they will be placed behind the round tops. So if you're familiar with Gettysburg on the third day, you know that's not where the action is. That's going to be more in the center of the lines of Pickett's charge. And so since the Vermont Brigade, so the second Vermont Brigade actually was very involved with stopping Pickett, but the first Vermont Brigade did not do much. So as a result, they will be sent to trail Lee's army as it retreats south. And there'll be some scattered fighting. About 10 days after Gettysburg, there'll be a small battle in Funkstown, Maryland. And Funkstown, Maryland is only a few hundred casualties. It just pales in comparison to the 51,000 plus at Gettysburg, but Henry is one of those casualties. Henry will be hit in the shoulder with shell fragments. So he's going to be out of the war for a little while. He'll be going back home to recover. And while he's back home, interesting thing happens in his life. He ends up engaged to be married. Engaged to a young girl named Laura Ainsworth. But we know from the letters it was a secret engagement. So we had another mystery to try to solve. Why is this a secret engagement? And we think we've got the answer. Because in the letters, Henry had been keeping a small notebook. And in his notebook, he was keeping track of letters he sent and letters he received during the war. Well, he had never corresponded with Laura Ainsworth up until this time. This is it's a small town. They were on the same age. They would have certainly known each other. So apparently, they were not very close until he goes home on his medical leave. And two of them must have really hit it off because they went on a picnic with a group of friends, and he proposed. So we're thinking, probably what was going on here was they probably thought that either her parents or his parents would not be happy about this whirlwind romance. He comes home with medical leave just like that, but engaged. But they're excited, they went to someone, so they tell their friends, but they say, don't tell anyone else. For 1 year, we're going to keep this a secret. And off goes Henry back into the war. Although actually not into the war at first. Next he ends up in New York City. Abraham Lincoln's called for a military draft. Draft riots broke out in several cities, the worst ones being in New York, where hundreds of people were going to be killed, thousands of injuries. The entire 6th Corps of the Army will be sent into New York City to maintain order and patrol the streets. So that's where Henry comes back from Vermont and rejoins his regiment. And so lots of letters where he talks about the give and take with the local people in New York City about why the Army's there, what they're going to do to maintain order. It's also around this time, Henry's brother Francis finally enters the service. Now Francis, he's the older brother, but he has stayed out of the war until this point. Francis has a lot of problems. He's got physical problems, like stomach disorders, but he also seems to have had kind of psychological problems. He seems to have suffered from depression, or what they would call melancholy back in those days. And so he stayed out of the war, but now he's going to enlist. We're thinking maybe it's because there's a draft. He's thinking he's going to maybe get drafted anyway, and there are the financial incentives, bounties being paid if you join up. Or, there also is just like a lot of pressure on young guys, expected to do their duty and join. So, for whatever reason he does join, he also is someone who writes very well. He's going to secretly work as a war correspondent for the Vermont Chronicle and Watchman. And when we found out his pen name, we were able to go up to Montpelier, get 19th century newspapers on microfilm and go through, and we were able to find all 12 of his dispatches they sent under his pseudonym, and include those in the book and with the letters. But at any rate, like I said, Francis does have a lot of problems. He, for one thing, he doesn't seem to have much in the way of friends. In one of his early letters, he's in the Vermont Brigade with a different regiment than his brother. In one of his early letters, he writes to his parents, he doesn't like going over to Henry's camp because there's so many young men from Williamstown there. There's a lot of people he doesn't like to see. But funny thing about Francis is that this war is going to destroy so many young men, physically and emotionally, in so many ways. But Francis is going to really thrive in this new environment. He's going to become healthier than he's been in a long time. He'll attribute it to the outdoor living, make him healthy. He is he likes the camp food. In the one letter he wrote home, the camp food agrees with him more than home cooking does. Must have made his mother feel great when she got that letter. So things are going well for him. He, in another letter Henry wrote home, he said they had been on a long march. He said Francis handled it really well, and he said he handled it as well as Henry did. And in another letter, Henry writes to his parents. He said he was over at Francis' camp. And he says to his parents, and Francis was happy. And he underlines the word happy. Like, can you believe it? Francis is happy. He says he has friends, he's doing well. And he'll be involved in some early fighting where he holds up well. He'll be fighting in the Bristow campaign, in the General Meade, and then next in the Mine Run campaign. So things are going pretty well, but things are about to go very, very badly for the Vermont soldiers. Ulysses S. Grant, recalled from the West, and Grant will decide on the major campaign, the Overland Campaign, starting with a battle in a place called the Wilderness, which some of you may be familiar with. In that battle, the Vermont soldiers, 6th Corps, a lot of the early fighting is going to be 5th Corps, but then comes word of a Confederate Corps moving up the Orange Plank Road towards the intersection with the Brock Road. Grant realizes if the Confederates take this position, they might be able to split his army, be able to defeat it in that way. And so the Vermont Brigade would be detached from Sedgwick's 6th Corps, sent down to that intersection, Hancock's 2nd Corps to move forward together to hold that position. Unfortunately, Hancock does not get the orders right away. The Vermont soldiers arrive first. There's about 2,800 men at this point in the Vermont Brigade. They will be facing Confederate Corps of more than 11,000 coming towards them. And they will refuse to fall back until Hancock's 2nd Corps does start to arrive and together hold that position. But in the meantime, this monument stands where they were making this stand, that out of 2,800 men, 1,234 casualties in the Vermont Brigade. Among them, both Henry and Francis. Francis was shot along the side of the neck. It was not life-threatening. Henry shot in the chest. As it turns out, Henry will die 3 days later, Francis by his side, able to write home to his parents about the death of his brother. Francis will then be in a hospital, actually in the Baptist Church in Fredericksburg, which is being used as a hospital. When Carol and I visited there last year, we decided just to walk into the Baptist Church there, and the first person we ran into was an assistant minister who just happened to be a Civil War buff and part of the Civil War Roundtable, was able to take us through the church, showing us where the soldiers had been, and it was set up as the hospital and all that. But anyway, Francis will be recovering while Grant keeps moving towards Richmond and Lee keeps moving to block him. Francis will finally be released and will rejoin his unit the day of the Battle of Cold Harbor, with all the terrible casualties there. But then Grant will decide, rather than trying to take Richmond, to move down, take Petersburg, and cut off supply lines to Richmond. So Francis will be part of the force that is starting to lay siege to Petersburg. Then the 6th Corps will be sent up into the Shenandoah Valley under General Sheridan, where at Cedar Creek they will be taken by surprise, Jubal Early's early morning attack. Very early in that attack, Francis saw one of his friends go down. He will go try to help him. In that process, Francis will be shot just above the ankle. He will be taken to a military field hospital, probably something similar to this, which is not the kind of place you want to be in the Civil War, probably. This being a Civil War surgeon's kit, composed largely of saws and blades, because the great danger is infection. They don't have penicillin or antibiotics, but if you amputate, then maybe the infection is not going to spread. And so Francis will be told that they don't know what they have to do. They're going to give him chloroform, put him out. He'll wake up in an outside recovery area, probably similar to this, to find that they had amputated the lower portion of his leg. He then will be sent up to Washington, D.C., to a military hospital similar to this one. And there they found that the amputation had been done so poorly that they needed to do a second amputation much further up his leg. Now, as it turns out, the doctor who was involved in this was from Vermont and was keeping his own record book, a book where he would put a photograph of each of his patients on one side and then on the other side, handwritten account of how he treated the patient and how it all worked out. And so we were able to find the doctor's book up at the University of Vermont in their special collections, and that's where we found the photograph of Francis after the second amputation, now up above the knee. Francis will be recovering from this, and he will write his last account for the newspaper during his recovery period. He says, the 19th of October, that's the day of Cedar Creek. Now, historic note was an episode in my life ending my career as a soldier and necessitating me to act for the remainder of my days in a sphere entirely different from what I would have chosen. And he then tells the story of being shot at Cedar Creek and 2 amputations. But the way he concludes, he says, "As this is the last of my series of letters as an Army correspondent, I will say in conclusion that while I regret the casualty which has befallen me, still it's only the fortune of a soldier, and I do not regret that I do not feel that I've served to no purpose in my country's call, nor feel that I've served to no, that I've not correctly responded to my country. Though I've never done all I could wish as a soldier, still I've endeavored to do my duty, not shrinking from danger or hardship when called upon, and I am satisfied. If others wish to engage in the same service, I would say to them, the chances are their lot may end up similar to my own. But the cause is worthy of the sacrifice, and I would bid them go forward." So after always enduring, he's saying it's worth it for the cause that they are fighting for. And so we're going through a long recovery period, eventually ordering a prosthetic leg, and we had the doctor's report of what he needed for his leg and with the letters. We had the actual brochure that he used to order his leg. He'll receive it and finally make it back home to the family farm there in Williamstown. And he'll be home for about 6 weeks. At that point, we found the newspaper account of what happened next. The title of the newspaper article was "Shocking Accident." The story will explain Francis and his father, Chester, had decided on their farmland there was a large boulder they wanted to get rid of. They went out and they dug a big hole, and they were going to pry the boulder into the hole and then bury it. But they couldn't budget. So Chester went back to get more helpers. While he was gone, we can only guess what happened. Our guess is Francis wanted to show that even on one leg, he could still do the heavy farm labor and try to move the boulder himself. When he didn't return home, his mother came looking for him and found him crushed to death beneath the boulder that had fallen back over on top of him. But he had said, regardless of what happens, for the cause they're fighting for, everything is worth it. And for those of us who spent many years in this, it's been a real worthwhile experience for us too. Went up to Vermont in those early years, went through all the records we could find on births and deaths and military records and marriages, and putting together all the connections to all these people, eventually making the family tree connection to the soldiers way back when my hair was still brown. We were able to make that connection to find these soldiers, and then ultimately to put together the book, Voices from the Attic, telling this whole story. I remember back when we first found the letters, I had mentioned to my younger daughter about finding all these letters and saying, maybe someday we would put it together into a book. And my daughter thought about that and said, well, do you think you could add in some vampires? make it a much better story. But I don't think we need the vampires. It's not a pretty good story as it was. So anyway, that is my story. So thank you all for listening. And do we have some questions?
Right here.
Yes.
Where are the original letters now?
Yes, we have the letters in acid-free folders in a climate-controlled storage area. We really have not decided what we're going to do with them. My guess is probably a historical society, like the Vermont Historical Society, would be a good home for them someday. But right now they're just sitting there. Yes.
How long ago was it that you found them?
It would have been back around 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. But I was still working then, so it was a long, slow process at first, and finally getting it all together and done. But it all worked out very well. I was approaching retirement and looking for something to do, and all of a sudden I had I am with a history background. Plus another thing is, I know how to read cursive. In another generation or two, people might have found these letters and it would be like hieroglyphics, and things like that. But we were able to put it all together and became a retirement project. This.
In all of the increments of war and battles, what were the timing increments? 3 days to walk from here to there?
Yeah, well, I mean, they were sometimes, walking as many as 20, 25 miles a day. And they were on the move quite a bit. And they were having a rough time with it, but yeah, they were infantry, so that's what they did. Yes.
Did you ever figure out how you might have been related to them?
Yeah, the relationship and something. It took us a long time to put together, but as it turns out, the father, Chester Morton, had 4 children. 2 of them had died rather young, and then the 2 boys died in the war, and then shortly after the war, his wife dies. So at that point, he's approaching 70 years old. He has a big farm by himself. He ends up getting remarried to a woman named Adelia Hill, and Adelia Hill had a daughter named Lucia. Benjamin Lucia Sibley had gone out to Kansas under the Land Grant Act and raised a family out there, but now the father, Chester Martin, his new wife, contacted Sibley's and say, would you consider coming back to Vermont and working this farm? And it'll be yours someday. So they do come back, including their children, one of them being a 4-year-old daughter named Bernice. Bernice will grow up and marry my grandfather. So we're thinking, as a 4-year-old, she was coming back to Vermont. It was like she had this new grandfather. Probably talked about his sons a lot, maybe read some of these letters to her. For whatever reason, when she got married to my grandfather, she must have decided to pack up this box of letters and take them with her. Now, as it turns out, she died relatively young too. She died in her 40s. But then my grandfather married my grandmother. So what we're thinking is, these letters would have still been there with them. So then, when my grandparents died, back in the 1980s, my father got to Vermont and cleared out their house. So we're thinking, he probably found this old box of letters, along with other things, brought them back to Pittsburgh. And I think what happened was, he put them up in his attic and said, I'm going to have to look at these someday. And never looked at them. So I don't think he had any idea. That's why he never told me he had all these Civil War letters. I don't think he knew what he had up there, sitting in the attic. But after he passed away, then we cleared out his house and found all the letters. So that is the story there.
In a few instances, you mention in the book that some of the transcriptions had cutouts.
Yes.
Where it looked like the signature on the opposite side of the page had been cut out.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
The reason oftentimes Civil War soldiers would do that is they would attach it, or people would attach it to photographs of the soldiers. So they would take a little letter, cut out the signature, and then attach that to the photograph. And so, and we found that with Henry, that one of the photographs we found from a collector had a piece of one of our letters attached to the photograph.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And also, Henry, in his writing, as the war progressed and his experience in the war progressed, shows more and more aptitude in understanding the military moves and strategy, etc. Do you think that is possibly a derivative of his classical education that he probably had at the Berry Academy, where they probably read some of the classics, which included...
Yeah, we've looked at the curriculum, and boy, the modern standards is just amazing, the things that they study. But I think it's a combination of that, and plus being an officer, whereas Francis is not to be an officer. In Francis' letters, he usually doesn't even know where they're at or what they're doing. He just said they walk past a creek somewhere. Whereas Henry somehow has information, or he's either talked with other officers or knows what's going on. He's able to put a lot more of that into his letters. Right. Okay, maybe
one final thing. Okay. Sorry, I did find this book fascinating. Francis, in most of his letters, as you say, doesn't speak too much to strategy and movements, because given the fact that he was a private. His brother Henry was a captain, ended up being a captain, I think. And so he might have, understood what was going on a little bit better than Francis did. But Francis is talking a lot about faith, and and as a matter of fact, in one of his letters home, he asks his father Chester if he wanted to know the Lord. That type of thing.
Yeah, what we know is that Chester was a church member. So Francis apparently is feeling that even though his father goes to church, that's not enough. He's taking another step, and so he is a very committed Christian. He writes a newspaper article, in fact, on faith and predestination, where he gives his ideas of that. So he's very interested in those topics. Maybe one last thing I just finish off with, people sometimes ask about, is what about the fiance? And that ends up being kind of an interesting story. The fiance, Laura Ainsworth, does get married a few years later. She marries a distant cousin, James Edward Ainsworth. They go west. James Ainsworth was a civil engineer with railroad companies, becomes very, very wealthy. In fact, there's a town in Ainsworth, Nebraska, named for him. They had no children, and when he died, Laura, this very, very wealthy widow, decided to come back to Williamstown, Vermont, to live, back to her hometown. And in that new role, she became kind of like a lesser version of Andrew Carnegie, and just giving her wealth away. And so in Williamstown today, the local library is the Laura Ainsworth Memorial Library. Outside of town is Ainsworth State Forest, with land she gave there. And nearby Norwich University is Ainsworth Hall, with money she gave to build that. And she gave money to fire companies and schools and all sorts of things. So it ended up having a real interesting life as it was. So all right, like I said, the book is available on Amazon. It's $19.95, or if you act now. I did bring some along, and so the ones I brought along, it's the same $19.95, but I paid for shipping, handling, taxes, all that's covered. So it's just $19.95. Although to keep things really simple, for an additional 5 cents to make it even 20, you can even have it signed by the author. So,